Hello, everyone. Welcome back to OTD Military History. Today we have someone probably a lot of you know who he is and seen him on World War II TV quite a few times. Niels Henkemans is coming on to talk about his multi-part book, which was me and Niels were chatting about that just before starting. It's got multiple parts, but Vol.1A is out now, so you can get that. So we're just going to be chatting about that and all the work he's put into this, because this has been a project that's I've known about this one for years now, and very excited to get to finally talk to him about him because, like I said in the description and some of the social media stuff, this stuff is groundbreaking and very much needed because we don't often see the German side of the hill, so to say, when it comes to D-Day and this depth especially. So very excited to talk about this. So Niels, thanks for coming on the channel. I very much appreciate it. So you took time to come hang out with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invite.
Of course. I'm surprised more people aren't clamoring to get you on, because this book, like I said, is very much needed because there isn't much here. And we can get into that a bit later, because I do want to start off. How I always start off with is, how did you come to be interested in the German side and Normandy in particular?
For me, it's been a gradual process. I've always been interested in history when I was a small kid. Romans were interesting, pirates, 100-Year War, things like that. And then as I got a little bit older in high school, I started becoming more and more interested in the Second World War. I think a lot of people have gone through similar development. And then I started building scale models. So planes are interesting, but I was more attracted to tanks for some reason. My friends were into aircraft, I was into tanks. And then I was always interested in models because I was interested in history. So it's not the building itself or the technical bits, but as a way for me, it was to connect with history. And then I I got deeper into this, and there were internet forums, and there was a lot of knowledge development. That was all still in my early teens. And then I became fascinated by the German use of captured equipment, especially old French two-man tanks.
Yeah, right.
So I wanted to know more about that. And when you started looking into those, basically Normandy, I started to focus on Normandy. And in Normandy, there's basically two areas where you can find these. Around Caen, as you know, 24th Panzer Division has a very interesting collection of converted captured French vehicles. Oh, yeah. But there were also two tank battalions on the Cotentin Peninsula. And I actually just wanted to build an accurate model of one of those tanks. Oh, okay. So I started reading up on this, and when you started collecting information, it very quickly became clear that a lot of what had been written, and there hadn't a lot been written at all, but a lot of what had been written was problematic, either because I could already see it's not correct, or there were mistakes in there. And then there were some archives, and British Cate started digitizing some of their newsreels. And then I came across Lafayette footage where they used some of these tanks to counterattack the Americans in the St. Mary's area. So I wrote an article about that on the internet, and then a few more. And people started saying, "Well, why don't you write a book about Panzers on the Cotentin Peninsula?" And I was thinking, "Are you nuts? I'm not going to do that. It's way too much." But people kept saying that, and I was starting to think, how much information have I collected already? And I think, well, I can at least give it a try. And at that particular stage, I started playing with the idea of writing a campaign book from an armor perspective. So US armor as well as German armor. So I also interviewed some American veterans of tank battalions. And I started laying out the basics and building a structure for how I'm going to do this book, how I'm going to approach this. And the more I was writing, the more I started noticing that there was a disbalance in the information. The American side of the story, well, not always accurately told, but yeah, the information was out there and you could get it. So that's not really the problem. But they were making a lot of guesswork analysis of the German side. They were making sweeping statements. And I was thinking, I cannot write a campaign book if I don't understand both sides of the story. because the American side doesn't make sense if you don't know the German side of the story. So I decided, okay, I need to close this and start looking more into the German side of things to be able to tell this story the way I wanted to, balance, and that meant starting to do your own research, and it's not just reading up on things, but also getting archival materials, microfilms that were fortunately being digitized and shared by people with much more research experience. That was very useful. So that's sort of how I rolled into this. So in the end, I've written now a book, and I'm working on a series on German troops in Normandy, but it's still a side project of the actual campaign book I wanted to write.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. The tanks tend to get a lot of us interested in this stuff. Yeah, I guess I could say the same for myself a little bit. Yeah, it's a fascinating. I always like to know this stuff of how people get into, particularly World War II, because there's usually only so many lanes to come in, and then that's one going on. So that's cool. So a question actually, which is from Andreas, one of our supporters from Germany. Was it tough for you to find a publisher for this book?
No, and that's also because I've been helping people with their research on the German. When they're talking about German side, they ask me questions, and I fact check things for people. I've helped write captions. Also for Panzerrex, my publisher, I've helped with a few books, either directly or provided information to people involved in writing volumes, especially Normandy volumes.
Right.
And I just happened to chat with the publisher, and he said, "You're working on a book," and I said, "Yes, that's true." He said, "Can I see it?" So I sent some samples, and he said, "Well, if you're interested, I'm interested." So that's how I got a publisher.
That's cool. And one more quick one here, you don't have to give too many details, but people do like to know, especially when writing books, do you do this as a full-time gig or do you do something else?
I do this part-time. I've been very flexible in my hours, and also spent a lot of this research started in 2006. So it's been and that's not full-time research, of course. Other projects, other work coming in. But as a teenager, there was so much knowledge being developed online, and
Right.
so there's a lot of things that, for instance, one of the shows I did with Woody on World War II TV about German armor in Normandy. That's stuff I sort of picked up along the way just by being active in my teens, and that I know for a lot of people that's new information, very detailed, but for me that was just that's the basic information for me. And when you're talking armor in Normandy, so there's a lot of things you gradually pick up. And what happened when I was writing this, there were a few people who were sending me materials. Simon True at some point became involved. He published a few books or edited a few books, interesting books about Normandy. And he turned out he was actually working on a similar project that I was doing. And he said, I've heard you're working on this particular part of Normandy. I'm also working on that. Can you tell me more about it? Can you show me something? So I sent it to him, and he said, "You're much further ahead than I am. Your German is also better than mine." So he said, "I have a lot of research materials, and if you can use it, here they are." So he's basically stopped his project and shared a lot of research materials with me, which is one of the ways that this book kept taking more and more time to write, because there was new information coming up, information that I either because other people had said that particular source isn't that useful, so don't bother looking into that, and then in this case Simon, but also other people started providing information. So it came in a few different sort of waves of information. Simon True provided a lot of information, but also a friend provided a lot of ultra records. Which also helped to that's stuff that I needed to add in because it gave a new perspective. So you keep going back and forth, and because there is the way I write this book, there is overlap between chapters because I focus on formations.
Right.
So when you change one bit in one chapter, it has effects in other chapters as well. So that's one of the reasons that the writing took a considerable time, and then COVID happened, and the publisher was dealing with things, and So that got delayed and delayed. So that's why we're now here in 2024, when the first version I considered finished at that time was in 2016 probably. So
wow, yeah, okay, wow, that's even long for book publishing. So COVID makes sense. Wow. Okay. Sorry, I'm just taking that in. So, a question that I've wanted to talk to you about is, you mentioned it briefly, right? How difficult sometimes the sources can be. I was hoping if you could just, kind of walk us through that. Like, have you been to actual physical archives in Germany, or did you have to go somewhere else to find some German records? Because I'm more interested in those right now, because I know more about the Allied stuff and how to go about doing that. But maybe we can talk about that after. But I'm just more interested in kind of how you go on about getting German sources, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, the first thing to realize is that when you're used to working with Allied sources, forget it when it comes to the German side. If you think you can get an after-action report from a company for a particular period, you're not gonna. On the area I'm researching, you're not gonna find it. Battalion level, you're not gonna find it. Regimental level, you're not gonna find it. Division level, you're not gonna find it. Army Corps level, you're not gonna find it, because these records no longer exist. And that's a problem you need to deal with in some way, one way or another. So when you go to the German archive, don't expect that. Sometimes you get lucky, and there are periods when records made it to German central archives. So that it's not true for every formation, every period. Absolutely not. There's some very well covered periods, but Normandy and the Cotentin Peninsula isn't, especially because this area was cut off. Units were destroyed. They destroyed their own records in the process, or they were lost in the fighting. So you can see this is the main problem. So one way you can start looking into German sources is by going to the microfilms. After the war, a lot of German records were captured. They were shipped to the United States. They ended up in the National Archives there. And then at some point they decided, we are going to digitize, we're going to turn these into microfilms. And then we're going to send the records back, the original records back to Germany. So a lot of the records that are in the German National Archives at particular levels, division level, Army Corps level, Army Group level, they are, most of them, a lot of the important ones have been microfilmed. And microfilms are, of course, quite easy to digitize.
Yes.
You have microfilm scanners, and then you can digitize them, and that's also something you can share online. Yep. So a lot of my research, when I really started stepping away from secondary sources and went to primary sources, were these microfilms. And I went to mainly Army level, but also Army Group level, because those records survived in fairly complete. So that's the level where I started working from.
Okay. Still there? Yeah, I can hear you. Oh, there we go. Yeah, you're back.
Okay. Yeah. So I went to Army Group level and Army level, and then I started researching those, reading those. Fortunately, I can read German. I'm Dutch, so we get German in high schools, and it's also the language is quite similar to Dutch, especially with a few years in high school. So I have no problem with that, which is, of course, an advantage I had that a lot of English-speaking researchers and historians do not have, and that of course complicates things. But it also meant that for me, I didn't have to rely on secondary sources.
Right.
I could go to the original source material and see what's in there, and that's also how I approached this entire writing process. I went back to the original records and basically tried to build our understanding of the Germans in Normandy from there. And that included trips to the archives, but like I said, the most important building blocks for me were the Army and Army Group level records, and from there I started to zoom in.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me, because I've done my own work like that, having to literally, as I say, like start from scratch, go to the building blocks and go there. That just made me think of this. Was there a moment when you, because you said this has been a very long process, when you were using secondary sources, was there a moment when you like hit a proverbial wall and said, I can't do this the way I want to do it with secondary sources? Or do you just feel like you were repeating what other people had done? Was there like a moment when you're like, I really got to get into this a lot more?
Well, when I was writing this campaign book from a German armor perspective and an American armor perspective, I started to realize that the Americans, after action reports, were saying certain things that I knew weren't true.
Right.
So I wanted to get the German side to balance out the information and get a more complete picture. And then I realized that the information wasn't in the American records, wasn't in secondary sources. So that's quite quickly I became more and more frustrated that I couldn't write the book I wanted to write because this information just isn't out there. And that's when I really started to turn into the primary sources and the archival material.
Yeah, makes sense. This one might be a little bit out there, but have you, from David, have you done any research with the Kriegsmarine archives in relation to Normandy?
No, very little, I should say. I've looked a bit into the coastal artillery. I have a lot, because most materials are digital now. I do have quite a lot of material from them, but it's something I want to do more on when it comes to certain volumes I'm planning for my books. There is one I want to do coastal artillery, and that one may well include a bit more Kriegsmarine material, but I still want to focus most attention on the fighting on land. So if there's a link there, but for instance, that should include formations and headquarters that were in Cherbourg. That includes ship, naval formations, but also supportive elements. There's a transport. There's a transport battalion that is involved in moving coastal artillery around. It's also used during the fighting to move heavy guns around because the Germans only have horses, very little motorization. But this naval element, mobile transport battalion, is around, and they provide support. So that's things where I looked into, but I haven't dug very deeply into the real naval part of things.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Sorry, I'm just thinking about that now because now you're just going to write more volumes, and there's going to be a whole bunch of information for us to take in. So I want to move into the substance of the book, to the content that you're looking at, because we were chatting about this before. Is when you start this book, can you just give us a kind of a quick overview of the events that, or broadly of what you actually cover in the book? Because a lot of D-Day or Normandy books start with May, maybe April and 44, but you've taken it way back further than that.
Yeah, I decided that this book should be, the first volume at least, and the start of the first volume should really be a layout of the foundation for people either not familiar with the German side of things, or people have read a lot of things, because I noticed that a lot of things are simplistically told or incorrectly told. So I wanted to lay a foundation so people can say, okay, I'm taking this book and I'm starting over for myself. So what I do in the book, I first talk a bit about the German chain of command in the West, in Normandy, in the summer of 1944, just to get a feel for who is who, where does Rommel fit in, which army is involved, which army corps are involved, and a bit of the divisions. So you get a bit of a feel for, okay, so this is the big picture for the fighting. And then I stepped back very much to the arrival of the 84th Army Corps, still had a different name at the time, and they came to Normandy in the spring of 1941. And because this Army Corps headquarters stayed in Normandy all the way up to the invasion, and even for much of June and July, and they were ultimately destroyed in the Falaise Pocket in August of 44. If you follow this Army Corps, you can get an understanding of the German developments in Normandy in the years preceding D-Day. And that's what I wanted to be able to show. How does this develop? How do the Germans look at things? How do they organize their defenses? What decisions are they making? So that's what I do with one of the main early chapters in the book, is laying out this particular period, explaining which division arrived when did it leave, what was it doing, how were the coastal defenses developing in this particular period. So to get a feel for what's going on, because a lot of things that happen after D-Day have been predetermined by German choices made sometimes in 1940. There's a coastal defense issue from General Paulus, who we all know from Stalingrad, and his 6th Army, at the time he wasn't commander, he was second in command, I believe, but his 6th Army in Normandy in July 1940, he already gives regulations and ideas on how to defend the coast. And there's decisions made at that particular year in July 1940 that helped understand how the Atlantic Wall was organized in Normandy and which areas were given priority. So if you can go back in time, a lot of things become more clear. So I wanted to do this chapter, and after that, I decided what I really wanted to do is take a closer look into individual German formations. And I want to do it like that because, like I said, a lot of information is missing. So you can't just pick up an after-action report and just use that as your source to write an entire chapter, because these records don't exist. So how do you reconstruct the fighting and what's going on? So I decided, and I started to realize that the best building block to do that are divisions. Divisions they're sort of the building block of the German military, the German field army here. And if you gather as much information as you can find about an individual division, and you start combining that for other divisions, you can build a complete picture. Because the Army Corps levels aren't there, but if you start looking at these divisions, you can tell their story, and you tell the story of all these divisions, you get you can get the most complete picture. And there's still information that's just been lost, and we need to accept that, but if you want to come close, for me, the answer is start focusing on formations, and divisions are the first one for me you should start with. So that's what I do in the book, and the first volume has general introduction for infantry divisions, so people get an idea of what is an German infantry division, because it's very different from, especially in terminology, from British division. It's closer to an American division. And after that, I start talking about individual divisions too in this book, and the next volume 1B will have 4 more divisions.
Yeah, which is coming out later this year, right? And I think I saw November.
November, probably, yeah.
That's what the website said. Sorry, I pulled up here. Coming November, straight from the horse's mouth. So yeah, that makes perfect sense. So question about the divisions, actually, if you will, for me, because obviously I don't know the West as well as I do what's going on further east in Normandy. But how do I want to say this? How is this divisional structure really influence how this part of Normandy is defended? I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, because for some of us, we kind of focus on different areas. So how the different terrain, because that's what we were talking about, and this is going to lead to the infamous bocage. But how does that play into it, or is it the German structure of organizing their military? Is that more important to how this is done?
There's a couple of things that are important to realize. You can see that, and also that's one of the reasons I wanted to start early for divisions and formations I look into. You can see that the Germans start to put in permanent divisions, and that's what a static division is. A lot of people interpret the word static as immobile, and that's true, largely true. But being immobile is sort of a consequence of the role they had been intended for. So they're not on the coast because they're static, right. But they are on the coast. They are static because they're on the coast.
Right.
And static means, basically, in the German terminology, doesn't mean immobile, but means belonging to a sector.
Right.
So you can also, and these divisions, and that's often confusion about armaments, a division can have static weapons, so they belong to that sector. And there can even be tanks, so they can be mobile, but types of armor can be static in that sense. And these coastal divisions that become static, a lot of them don't start out that way. Some are created to be used in this role. So that's what you can see on the coast. And in addition, Omaha is famous for having a regular German infantry division, the 352nd, although there was basically only one infantry battalion directly behind Omaha Beach, which had troops being able to be in the battle, and other elements were further east, further west, and artillery further inland, which was very important. So you can see that being used. And this German way of using their coastal defense formations in this particular way, the Germans also realized that we need to do more than that, because these are not going to be unable to counterattack. And one way Germans think, how can we use these static formations, which they had a lot of in France, to be able to support other sectors? Because if they're at their location in Brittany, because a lot of the area, Brittany was the primary source of reinforcements for the sector I'm researching, the Cotentin. So how can these divisions contribute something to the fighting if the fighting is not in their sector? So you can see that Germans, what they're doing is they come up with a program. It's for increased mobility. So they're going to provide additional horses to these formations, bicycles, motorization, and often they use this to build a battle group within these divisions. There can be a battalion. Usually they try to build a reinforced regiment, which they can move around, sort of a mini division. And they form these formations to be able to reinforce other sectors. So that's one of the ways the Germans spend a lot of time in. You can see that in the records. They go in starting mid-1943, then it really kicks up, but it's already going on earlier. That's how they try to increase their mobility and hope to create reserves. So that's how these coastal divisions are very much influenced in which elements get bicycles,
Right.
mobility, trucks, motorization, but also horses. And this comes with all sorts of practical problems because this equipment, this extra mobility, is extra. So it doesn't really belong to the organization.
Right.
And so they can also take it away from you, and which does happen on quite a few occasions.
Right.
But it also means you don't, in your organizational charts, your table of organizational equipment, you do not actually have drivers, for instance. So where are the drivers going to come from? And that's one of the dilemmas that the Germans have to work with, and how are we going to do it? And sometimes they use French civilians as drivers. In other cases, they need to take them from the support elements, or even from the fighting units. So that's how this idea of building some sort of a mobile reserve starts to affect how these units are formed.
Yeah, I mean that makes perfect sense. And I completely forgot about the assets that can be given to a division but taken away. Completely forgot about that because, again, how I do things, right, with the system, it's integrated into the division, right? The division has its own transport and all that good stuff. So it's still trying to wrap my head around that one. But I mean, because I've learned about that before, it's one of those things that I knew and forgot. But yeah, so leading to these two divisions that you've covered in Volume 1A with the 91st and 77th. Was there, when you really got into the detail, was there anything that kind of struck even you as something that you didn't really know before, or something quite surprising about how this was going on? Or does it really fit along with what you had read previously about how these defenses were being set up and learning as they're doing this?
Well, it's very important to realize that the 6 divisions I'm covering in Volume 1A and B are all different, and quite different actually. So if you start looking into an individual division, German division, you will, unless it's part of a specific group of divisions being created at the same time, you will find differences. Now, these 2 particular divisions, the 77th and 91st, are part of the same group of divisions. They are created in January 1944, but the 91st becomes an air landing division in March. So these are supposed to be identical divisions, and then the Germans say, we're going to create a division we can transport by air. You're thinking, it's 1944, you're losing your control of the skies all over Europe, but you're going to build a division that is air transportable. Optimistic, to say the least. But
quite a bit, yeah.
Yeah, and there's talk about using them to reinforce the Crimea. There's talks of using them in Scandinavia. There's talk of using them otherwise, because this particular division is a central German command reserve, OKW reserve. So that's why. This is a division they could use and then you can see as we get close to D-Day, they start to realize we need to reinforce the West, and this division gets shipped to the West. And from Germany, it's on the border with France. Actually, it's in modern day France, but then it was in an occupied area. So it's in the area, and they decide to move it first to Brittany, and then they realize, oh wait, we can't get the Fallschirmjäger division we had intended for Normandy is not going to be ready in time the second, which is why we do end up with the 6th Fallschirmjäger regiment at Cotentin.
Yeah.
People know that one from Ben's Brothers, probably. So that was sort of preceding the rest of that division, but the division was in no shape to take a defensive role. So they sent in this particular other division. And this division is unique in a lot of ways. And that's you know that to some extent because people write about that. And again, it's sweeping statements, it's generalizations. People
Right.
say, yeah, the artillery regiment was equipped with mountain howitzers, and then you say yes, four of the four of the 9 batteries were equipped with mountain howitzers. So the majority wasn't. And nobody talks about the other battalions. And these are also the 2 of these batteries with normal German equipment are the battery from Brecourt, which we also know from Band of Brothers, of course. Yeah. And it was there because it was not an atypical battery for this particular division. So they could spare these 2, because there was another one, a battery at Oldie, and these 2 batteries were different from the rest of the division. So they used them to reinforce the coastal defenses rather than support the division itself. And there's all sorts of things what you can see, and things once you start digging into these formations that are unusual, and this is something that you pick up along the way. So I stopped making I have a general idea what a German division looks like, but you will never really know what you're going to encounter.
Right.
And it's within a sort of bandwidth for me, but for people who are not familiar with the Germans, I'm pretty sure they will be quite surprised by the kind of material divisions have or don't have, because there's also divisions that are far better equipped than people think, like the 352nd at the Omaha Beach.
Yeah, like that's what I wanted to, because I wanted to kind of ask that next, because how you explain it makes perfect sense in what I know you've done and everything you've researched in the difference, because that's one of the things I think some people know about is, and a question I have is these 2 divisions in particular, because we're focusing on this part of the volume, are they using a mixture of, say, captured French, Soviet, German, even Polish? Some of that stuff made its way to Normandy, right? Is that kind of, it's hard to generalize with these units, like as you just said, but is it a mix, or are they not reliant on that in these 2 divisions specifically?
Basically, it's all German equipment in these divisions. These are formed as not regular German infantry division, but sort of regular divisions. The Allied intelligence calls these particular divisions, this group, called the 25th Wave in the German system. The Allies call them pocket divisions because these only have 2 regiments. So there's a bit of a thing, but these are almost completely equipped with modern German equipment. They do have some infantry guns in the infantry regiments that are Russian, but you can see these being used a lot in the German system. So these are not really, it's not really odd that they're using these, because these are quite standard also in the German system. If you're talking about Russian weapons or French weapons, no, they're not really being used. You might find some occasional things. Pistols don't really matter, but they're often Polish or Belgian, but pistols are, of course, not going to make a difference in a big battle. So those get very little attention, but all the heavy equipment, the machine guns, but also the normal rifles are all German.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense given what I know a little bit anyway about what's being used at Omaha specifically, because I've done a little bit of work on that in the past couple of months. But that leads, I think, to the inevitable other question that comes up with Normandy and the Germans, because again, I think we had a question earlier about the Allied plan of basically how to cut them off. And I know that's a little more complicated and not really what we're talking about today, but also from your perspective in studying this, the logistics in this, does it seem to be a situation where it seems to be better at the beginning and then gets worse? Is it more or less the same the entire time? I'm asking that because that's the kind of that general sense we have of these things, right? Is that the German logistics aren't the best and get worse as it goes. So is that accurate, or is that another myth that needs to be busted here?
No, that's generally very accurate. The Germans are facing a major problem, and that's mobility in general, and that's going to affect everything. German divisions have themselves very little mobility, very little trucks. So if they want to get material equipment, there are cases where they really spend days getting sending their trucks out to get fuel or anything. So there's massive problems. A regular infantry division at this time has about 4,000 horses. That's a regular German mobile. It's considered a mobile division because it can move on its own at the same time. That's a mobile division in the German system. Now, you're not going to pick up supplies hundreds of kilometers behind the front line with horses. So these need to be brought up by truck to supply points, supply dumps, and the Germans try to get as much mobility in they can. So they're using trucks from the Luftwaffe, from the Kriegsmarine, the Organisation Tod is very important in bringing up supplies. Auftrag is the Germans call that. So there is all sorts of ways they try to bring up supplies. One of the things that's, I don't have the statistics at hand, but there is at some point the Germans are debating and talking about their counterattack. And I think it's von Rundstedt who says, or Rommel, Army Group B, or OB West, I don't quite remember, but they say we need this many tonnage of supplies a day to counterattack, and we need this many tons a day to be able to defend. And even the amount they need to properly defend is, I believe, about 50% of what they, double of what they have in transport capacity. So there's all sorts of problems. And it varies a bit on the different sectors, and you can see them complaining on different sectors. You can imagine if you have an infantry division, a lack of fuel isn't your biggest problem because you don't have a lot of motorization. So you can see that on the Peninsula, there's very few complaints about shortage of fuel. On the other hand, at some point, they're complaining about not having enough ammunition for the machine guns and for the artillery, especially the artillery is problematic. So you can see these basic things when, I mean, ammunition for machine guns seems sort of basic. That must be, well, and there's complaints about that. So the different periods, different problems, but in general, the Germans have massive supply problems. It's not necessarily catastrophic on the short term, but in the long term, it becomes, of course, if you have massive artillery support, it becomes more difficult for the enemy to attack. You're going to take more. If you don't have it, you're going to take more losses yourself. So the balance starts to shift. So that's how things influence on the long term. The Germans can't play the same game of attrition, which is why you would need as much ammunition as you can get to sort of counter that. And the Germans are in no position to deal with that. There are talks sometimes when the Germans say, well, this particular battle in this particular period went very well because we had enough artillery. And when we didn't, it became a problem. So in the reports, there was not really a lot of talk about Allied air support. That was one of the things I found quite surprising.
Interesting.
The air supply the air problems are probably further inland. These are determining the amount of supplies you're getting and and the percentages of supplies that are being sent out that are actually getting through to the front. But if you're at the front, for most cases, when you're well dug in a hedgerow, you don't have to worry too much about Allied air support. But one problem are the spotter planes, of course, which direct artillery. So there's that particular problem, and that's something you can read a bit more about. But I was quite surprised on how little information there is on the peninsula about complaints about the Allies using air support. There's a few cases, but it's not as much as I would have expected. And I also don't get the idea that this is missing because we don't have a lot of records, because these are complaints that would have traveled up the chain of command. And what you do get is requests or urgent demands for air support, and then complaints that the Luftwaffe isn't supporting them. So there's that bit, but there's generally not a whole lot of complaints about Allied air supremacy, because that apparently is not the main problem.
I mean, that makes sense if you think about it, given the terrain. But I'm going to come back to that in a second if that's all right. This is probably outside the scope of anything you looked at, but maybe this is a North American kind of question about the canal boats. Is that being used? Does that come up at all in your research, or is this all based on rail?
No, this is a subject you hear about something, but I don't have any sort of statistics or the importance of that. I know they were used, and there's also stories about shipping being attacked which were transporting down pilots and trying to smuggle them to Allied lines. Stories like that, but it's not something I've looked into very deeply.
And just another quick one here before I get back to what we were talking about there with the terrain was there any German airfields in the peninsula where they all moved inland by this point?
There were none with aircraft operating. So there's a couple that were there. There was Maupertus or Tayville, that's east of Cherbourg. That's still an active airfield today, and that was it. At some point during the fighting, it was considered as a place where the Germans would drop an airborne regiment, a paratrooper regiment, until clearer heads prevailed, and they were thinking, well, what difference is this going to make? But there were actually plans to drop reinforcements on the peninsula. That would have been there. Cherbourg also had a seaplane base in the harbor. A bit further west, there was another small aircraft, and there was an airfield also at Les Save, much further south, which was guarded by Luftwaffe troops, but had been rendered inoperable by obstacles and things like that. They weren't used, so there wasn't a German Luftwaffe presence that was able to take to the skies and make any sort of role in the fighting. And there was an airplane hangar on the peninsula as well, a French one, which is worth mentioning, and it's still there. And if you can go visit it at Ecosville, that's northwest of Utah Beach, it's very impressive. Massive structure.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay, so I want to work from the beach kind of backwards here for a little bit. So this is an interesting way of looking at that. Is there a plan for the pre-bombardment? Is there any way of that, or is that something just that they're hoping the concrete and digging in will take care of? Is this discussed at length in any way?
When I look at the Army Corps level records and 7th Army records, there is almost no talk about naval artillery. I think this is something. Coastal artillery in the German system is quite complicated because a part of it is related to dealing with actual ships at sea and approaching craft, and then at some point it shifts over to Army control instead of Navy control when troops start landing. And there's this constant struggle. At what particular point are these considered approaching troops or are these landing troops? And there are naval batteries that are better suited to deal with ships, but there's only a few along the beaches. Basically, if you look at lower Normandy, the area of 84th Army Corps, what you get is there's the battery at Long-sur-Mer, and there's the Marcouf battery, Saint-Marcouf, which most people call, the Allies call Cheeseback. So these are two modern batteries, but that's basically the only real batteries that are considered suitable to deal with naval gunfire. But for the troops in Normandy, I've not seen anything that they were majorly concerned about this naval artillery. It seems to have been very much, we'll deal with it when it comes. Our mission is to hold the coast. And in a way, it doesn't really matter. What you can see when Rommel comes in is he starts looking at, especially when Rommel comes also a little bit before that, they start looking at which type of fortifications can withstand bombing, which is not a big leap to say, okay, bombing and shelling, so what particular type of defenses you need. The Germans have different types. They have field type defenses, but they also have reinforced field type defenses. Those are have some concrete, but not a whole lot. And then you have fixed permanent fortification, and those are much stronger. And then there are assessments of what do we need, what makes sense to put effort into this, especially so close before an expected invasion. And then you can see them say at some point, well, okay, let's stop doing this and use all the concrete we do have only for these particular things. So if you look at this, the Germans are very much on the Rommel, especially, they're very much focused on the coast, and nobody's really thinking too much about what's going to happen afterwards. There's supply zone dumps. Also because the Germans don't have the initiative at all, so they are very dependent on what the Allies are doing. And also in Normandy, they almost never have any form of initiative, which is one of the reasons the Allies are able to counter all the German reinforcements coming in, because they force them into the line immediately, because the Allies keep pressing. And the Germans are constantly reacting. And this naval bit is, you could say they underestimate that, but you can also say there's also no talk about really a lot of talk about the use of air forces. So they say, yeah, the vehicles need to be well dug in and protected, but there is no. And there was one of the interesting, what I find quite funny is at some point there is an order, and they say if we need to place these asparagus in the fields against gliders and airborne troops, and someone has to issue an order. You cannot cut trees lining roads because we need them for camouflage to move our troops on. So apparently people were thinking we move in our vehicles and we cut the trees along the roads and it's easy. They had to be told, no, you cannot do that because that's actually bad for us. And that's one of the few bits where you can say they're really thinking about what they're doing, but also the other people carrying out the work apparently didn't really think that particular one through.
Huh. That's interesting. I mean, because, well, you've been there, I've been there, a bunch of us have been there. The roads are usually tree lined and they're quite nice. So that makes sense. But also that, given to cover those empty fields and that's where they are. So that makes perfect sense. This is expecting to be kind of blowing my mind with some of this stuff, but not in that way. But that makes perfect sense again, that they would not be thinking about these things and then have to kind of change how they're going about it in that sense. So I want to kind of go back to what we were talking about there with the air power there, and that not really being much of a perceived factor anyway, is the bocage. It's impossible not to talk about. And we always hear, particularly in the West and English-speaking countries, of how difficult it is for the Americans and the different tactics and literally equipment that has to be adapted. I know, again, it's hard to get down to the lower levels, but two questions on this then is that the defense planning that they eventually do use in the bocage, is that planned well in advance, or is that done as an ad hoc thing? And also, do the Germans have issues with fighting in the bocage? Does it cause them problems too?
I've looked into this and I kept coming back to only one particular document about the German doctrine in the bocage, and that's from 1943. It's written by General Marx, who at that particular point was stationed in Brittany, and Brittany also has bocage, especially in the northeast corner. And he was there, and he decided for his corps, at my army corps at that particular time, he wrote instructions on how to defend, how to attack, how to have different tactics. So he was thinking about this, and this particular memo or instructions he wrote also were sent to Lower Normandy, to 84th Corps, which he then took over. And this particular document I've also found in other parts of France, because apparently it was just sent around, but it was only really relevant for 7th Army, because they were in Brittany and in Normandy. And in it, he lays out some principles of fighting in the bocage. And this is something that I have no doubt was spread along infantry divisions that were in the bocage area. But we also don't need to remember that these coastal divisions were the bulk of the German divisions in Normandy. So they were on the coast, and they weren't expected to fight in the bocage. So to them, it doesn't. I have my doubts how much time and effort was put into training this and preparing this, but this also brings us this document on the German problems, because the Germans realize that, and that's something if you realize what's going on in Germany with attrition in Normandy, the fighting. One of the things that Marx says is the Germans like to use their heavy machine guns, and a German heavy machine gun is not a caliber thing, but it's mounted on a pedestal with a gun sight, and you can provide sustained long-range fire. And especially if you have multiple machine guns sweeping an entire area, you can imagine how you can deny that to an enemy, or if they want to pass through that, they're going to suffer massive casualties. And this is something you might want to you can use in the more open terrain in the British and Canadian sector, but in the bocage this doesn't work, because your field of fire is just the field in front of you.
Yeah.
And if you're being outnumbered, you want to be able to use your machine guns to cover a wide area as possible. And this is also true for your mortars, for your infantry guns, for your artillery. But the more obstacles are in the way, you can't do that. And you need to put in more and more weaponry to each weapon. If you have one machine gun per field, it's already probably not enough. So you need to try to put in two. That's also you see at Saint-Lô, where the Americans try to ultimately figure out how the Germans are defending and how they need to deal with this. But if you have less and less weaponry and less ammunition, you can imagine that the Germans are starting to struggle with this. Another problem with this is that in open terrain you can see the enemy coming. In the bocage, you can't see them coming. Sound is muffled, so they can be right on top of you. Before you realize it, you can use it to your own advantage when you want to attack, but if you are defending, you can be surprised. So what Marx is saying is what is key in the bocage is initiative, being mobile, reacting to things, taking opportunities. And that's, of course, something that requires well-trained troops. And that's something the Germans are struggling with. Like I said, the 77th and the 91st Air Landing Division are raised only in January 1944. That's when they start forming. And yes, they do have some experienced personnel, but a lot of these are recruits. And fighting in Normandy requires more skill than fighting in a traditional open field. And of course, or at least takes different skills. And if small unit initiative becomes more important, you want your troops to be better trained. So that's a problem the Germans are facing, and that's also something that, for instance, General Gavin of the 82nd Airborne Division, after Normandy 45, I believe he writes a report on his experiences in Normandy, and apparently they had been collecting German records there as well. And he says and there's also another report from one of the 506, I believe, parachute infantry regiment, and they say the Germans were well entrenched when we landed, and we were in major trouble if only they had come out of their foxholes and actively pursued us.
Right.
And that's the kind of initiative that these German troops were lacking, either because they weren't trained in that, or because they weren't used to the terrain, because they arrived on the peninsula only the 91st only in say the second week of May, so they're not very familiar with the terrain either. And that's true for most formations that end up fighting in the peninsula. They had not been fighting in the bocage.
Right. Huh. Yeah, I didn't know the timelines on the divisions arriving, so that makes perfect sense, especially given what you talked about and how divisions are formed, organized, and all of that. It makes sense that they aren't there that long, so they're not going to be able to understand the ground they're fighting on, because again, it's so difficult to see to begin with, and then if you don't have air support or aerial reconnaissance like the Allies have in heaps, it makes it very difficult to plan in that regard. Yeah, that's fascinating. So these are the kind of myths that I was really hoping you would help us look into, because you hear these things and then there's these general sweeping statements, like you said, of it's this way and it's this way and it's this way. When you actually look into it, it's not quite so. So that's fascinating. We had a few kind of spread out questions throughout the chat, if that's all right, if I can ask a few. Sorry, I just missed a couple. Sorry, they got peppered in here. So the one was about your future work, not the next volume. Oh, sorry, not the next part of this volume, but the next. I think it was Kevin asked about when you're going to cover the 716th Division.
I've started doing research about the German divisions in the Calvados, so the part where the American 5th Corps landed, but also the British and the Canadian sector are, and I do intend to turn that into a volume. But one of the things why I'm focusing for now on the American sector is because I work a lot with Allied intelligence to reconstruct these German formations based on captured records, prisoners of war. And it becomes increasingly difficult if you need to start combining sources from the Americans, from the British, from the Canadians, from the French, from the Poles at some point. So when I do that, I want to start focusing more attention on the British and the Canadian sector and starting looking into their records very much more. So it's something I've started looking into and started writing a layout for, and a lot of the things I already know because I now have a format I can follow to write it. And if I do it, I'm not going to put any sort of timeline on that, but it's likely going to be the 352nd Infantry Division, the 716th Infantry Division, but also the two divisions that opposed the 6th Airborne Division. And that's the 711th German Infantry Division, Aesthetic Division, and also the 346th Infantry Division. And these were coming from the east, from the 15th Army sector. There's also a bit wider I need to go with the German side. But again, I've already collected quite a lot of records for those. But before I start to assemble that, I really want to dig deeper into the British and the Canadian archives to get more information about these particular formations, even if there is a bit more in the German archives as well.
Yeah, I mean, well, you need help with the Canadian stuff. I know a guy can help out. So let me know. Archives is not far from me, so I can definitely help. And I already know I've already found a few things that I should send you. I keep forgetting. That will help you once you get there. But again, everyone's already enjoying your work so much they want more. So this one's an interesting one to me because Channel Islands, right? It survived till the end of the war basically with minimal supplies. We had David on who talked about what's going on with those and all of that. Do you plan on this? Could be like, I don't know, real future. Do you ever plan on looking at that and how this plays into the German side of things, right? Because I'm still not so clear on myself if it's part of the same defensive structures and all that sort of stuff.
It's a very good question, and it's also one of the things I had to make a decision on in this first volume, because in the German system, in the German defenses, the Channel Islands are sort of a separate entity. They belong to 84th Army Corps, but a lot of what's going on there has absolutely no consequence for what's going on the mainland. So, and especially because I was thinking I might do a book on the Channel Islands and the 319th Infantry Division there and all the support elements, but also Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine. I decided to leave a lot of that out in the first volume. So when I talk about the organization in Normandy from the spring of 1941 to D-Day, I do mention the Channel Islands, but only really when there is a connection with the mainland in one way or another. There's things happening there that are very interesting, but for the fighting in Normandy and the organization of the German defenses in Normandy, the Channel Islands are not, and that was one of the things that surprised me, are not very relevant. They exist sort of as a separate entity, and if it's possible, I might do a book about them at some point. But I also know there's a lot of people on the Channel Islands who have been working on the German formations there for a long time, and it's possible that they are much farther ahead with that, and much easier for them to do that. On the other hand, I also know that you really need to focus specifically on Germans formations and not do it as a side project, because then it's still not going to work. And that's one of the problems I tend to have with a lot of books that do mention the Germans, but they usually only mention the Germans as a way to tell the Allied story. So if you want to say the Allies were brilliant, you pick up the Germans, or you say they were crap at all these particular things and look at how good we were, or you say the Germans were brilliant and we were crap, or the Germans were brilliant but we still won, so we were even better.
Yeah.
And a lot of the statements that are being made have very little to do with the German side of things, but it's far more a tool to tell a particular story an author wants to tell. And that's something, if you really want to get a balanced view, I think you really should take the German side as seriously as the Allied side. And that's also one of the reasons I wanted to write this particular series of books, so that people who don't speak German and have no access to these particular archives and documents, they have something they can pick and they can look into the back of the book, and all the sources are there. So I'm not making this up. I'm not extrapolating on things. You can see where I'm going from. So I wanted people to have something that, if they want to know something about how did the Germans do that, what's going on there, that they can just pick up my book and say, okay, this is well researched. This is not a repetition of what a German officer said in the 1940s when he was trying to make himself look good and others look bad. Or it's also not a statement from an Allied journalist who wrote a book and is making certain claims that people have repeated again and again and again, and nobody has gone back to the original source to see if did it even make sense. because often it doesn't, and it's not based on anything, or it's not based on anything we can check. So that's why I wanted to build this from zero, basically.
Well, that's a major issue that I've come across myself. Is these supposed primary sources are not even close to that, and then the trail just kind of goes cold, and you can't find it. So that is something I definitely appreciate. Is looking at it that way. Just two quick questions about kind of the nature of the troops. Were the recruits well trained? Because you say they don't get there until early 44 or even spring 44. Are they well trained? Are they training in Normandy? How does that kind of quickly look like?
What you usually can see is that the basic things, squad level tactics, training, weapons training is for these particular divisions is they've had that basic training, but what lots of these troops are missing is being able to operate at companies, at battalion level, integrated arms. One of the things Gavin also notes is that Germans are complaining, based on captured records or prisoners of war interrogations, that the Germans are attacking into areas without notifying the artillery. So the artillery doesn't know where the attack is taking place, so they cannot support them, so they don't do anything, or they're firing in an area where the Germans are attacking. So there is this all these coordination issues are taking place. In case of the 91st Air Landing Division, we actually have the training schedules for this particular division. Okay. So that's quite interesting to see what's going on. So there's some things we can reconstruct from there. And one of the things, for instance, is that there's a lot of talk that the 91st Air Landing Division was specially trained for anti-airborne operations. And ultimately, when I look into these records, only one regiment had spent some time of it in the 8 week of its 9 weeks of training. Yeah. And it was only part of all the different things they were doing that particular week. So to say the 91st Air Landing Division was specifically trained for anti-airborne operations, that's just not true. It should also be realized that all German troops that were not immediately on the coast were trained in some sort of anti-airborne operation, because the first enemy they were probably going to encounter were airborne troops. So there is, everybody is doing a bit of that. But specific training, it's possible that this division had some more experience in that, or that they were getting information because they were supposedly being able to be transported by air, and there were links with Fallschirmjäger. So they might have known a little bit better on how to deal with this particular threat. But to say they were heavily trained in this, specifically trained, that's just not what the records show us.
Yeah, I think I've heard that before, because people, say that they're in the area because then the Americans land there, and it leads to just
more Wilmot.
Yeah.
1952, that's where it comes from. I tracked it down, and that seems to be the source.
Why should I be surprised in that?
And anyway. No footnote, of course.
Of course not. I don't think he even knew how to do those. Anyway, I don't want to talk about him anymore. So this is an interesting question too, because I don't know. Once they say these units arrived, these two in particular, were any of their constituent parts taken out and taken somewhere else, or did they stay whole when they were there?
That could happen in different ways. You can see it's basically the autumn of 1943. You can see battalions being taken from these divisions and being replaced by Eastern battalions, Eastern volunteers. So usually one German battalion gets replaced by two Eastern battalions. But in all the other moments, starting very early in the war, they are taking the best troops from these divisions. If troops at specific age and are considered suitable for the Eastern Front, they can get transferred there. They can be formed into either makeshift formations or just sent individually. But thousands and thousands of people, tens of thousands, you should even say, are being transferred from the West to the East during the war. Right. And that's going to affect an entire division, because if you're told to provide, say, a battalion or a company, but those people need to be fit for the Eastern Front, and those are more stricter rules. They need to be fitter. So you don't have that in a particular company in these static divisions. So you need to take your best men from a lot of different formations in that division and ship them out. Right. At the same time, we also, of course, I mentioned those, but that only becomes relevant when the fighting starts. These are the battle groups that are being formed in these divisions, and these are being used to move towards the front. So those are really involved in the fighting in the west. But for the rest, it's mainly personnel and formations being sent to the east. Sometimes also equipment, but that sort of is an early war thing, because by the end, towards 1943, 1944, the weapons have already been replaced. So you're not going to you're not going to send your French guns towards the Eastern Front, but they have already taken the German guns and have already sent them there. So, and in replacement, they've gotten Russian guns or Czech guns or French guns. So that's how this goes. So that particular change doesn't continue, but you can still and this manpower exchange, what the Germans call exchange Austausch, East-West. So you can also get what you get in return are often people no longer fit for the Eastern Front because of age or injuries. A lot of people with frostbite are getting sent to the West. There's one of the better groups that can be in the West are protected classes. So if your father died in the First World War, then you have some sort of protection and you are not going to be as easily sent towards the Eastern Front, or if you have to provide for large families, or if your brothers have already been killed. There are certain groups with exceptions, but as the war progresses, these people get these special groups get cancelled more and more, and ultimately, basically, everybody gets sent to the front.
Yeah, as these things tend to go for most sports. That's a pretty universal thing, I think. This is an interesting question. David's asking, was there a particular unit that you were surprised to learn about in the research? Maybe something unusual unit maybe you didn't know too much about, or a specialty unit in some sort of way?
Well, the second volume is going to cover a lot of the Eastern troops, and I mean, you heard people talk about them, and there were so many. This percentage or that percentage of troops in Normandy was not from Germany, or not even Volksdeutsch, ethnic Germans, and I found those fascinating to research. There's one particular battalion that was one of the first created, and I'm following that particular battalion all the way to the fight in the Caucasus against the Russians, the Soviets, I should say. And those formations were very, very interesting, especially also when you start looking into how these are being perceived by the Germans, because you have a lot of people with the racial prejudice. What are these guys doing here? But there's also a lot of German officers who have been living in certain countries in the East, Baltic Germans, for instance, but also other parts, and these really feel sympathies for these particular ethnic groups of Soviet citizens. So you can see this going on, that they are constantly trying to help these particular ethnic groups to protect their interests and to contribute to the Wehrmacht. And then on the other hand, you have the very doctrinal racist approach of Nazi Germany that's going the other way. And I found this really fascinating. And also when you start looking closer into these formations, it's very messy morale things. Also, why did they do this? Who's going to give you an honest answer on why they were ending up in a German uniform? So that's one of the things That's one of the things I try to avoid, because you're not really going to get a straight answer from anyone. Sometimes you do, because then they say, no, we believe in the German cause, then they'll probably believe in that. If you still say that after you've been captured, you probably because it's also possible you want to say that to try to avoid being sent back to the Soviet Union. So that's very tricky. But there are German reports where the Germans themselves start to try to figure out what the problems are, where they're coming from, how they need to deal with this. And those tend to be very frank in their assessments of their own mistakes made in creating these formations. So these Eastern troops are some of the units that really surprised me in how interesting they are and how complex the subject is.
Yeah, it's one I've because I've seen a little bit, and there's tons of myths around them, and numbers in particular. Like, people tend to think that it's mostly Eastern troops in Normandy, which I have no idea where that comes from. Maybe somewhere made it in a book somewhere at some point make that claim, but it's something that's not very well known, and for all kinds of reasons, right? Like you just explained about, why they volunteer, and what they don't want to do, and stay alive, and all those kinds of things. And it's a fascinating one to look at, and I hope you can find some good stuff for us on that one, because that's definitely one I don't know hardly anything about.
No, and another group I find interesting are these ethnic Germans, these Volksdeutsche, and
Yeah.
a lot of people talk about them a lot. And there's so many. This is the percentage they are in the German military in Normandy. And then I start looking at the numbers of POWs, and you can imagine that people who are not very fanatical or very convinced of the German cause are easier to defend or to surrender. And yet, when you look at prisoner of war records, these groups are not that prevalent. And if you look at German records, there's only one real. There's a few groups, but the group they're most they're really concerned about are so-called People's List 3. Those are basically Poles that they consider of German origin,
Yeah.
and these guys are pretty much forced into German ranks, and the Germans are very well aware that this is a problematic group. So they say they can only be 8% in a particular formation. A lot of them get sent to support elements. They are used in fighting units, but they're often sent to crew served weapons. So they're just not one of among other proper Germans. And there is very little talk about other groups of ethnic Germans or real ethnic Germans, which leads me to the conclusion, and of course it's difficult to prove that, but because they're not mentioned, I get the impression that those were not considered a problem, because otherwise there would be mention of them.
Right.
Other groups that were problematic were people from annexed parts of France, Belgium,
Yeah.
and these particular guys were, there were orders, you cannot use them in this particular theater or that particular theater or not in that particular fashion. So the Germans are aware there are problems, but a lot of these ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe, they are not mentioned as a separate group. And to me, that's an indication that these were not considered a major problem. And that's something that if you read about Normandy, you get the impression almost everybody was an ethnic German and not a Reichsdeutsche, but a Volksdeutsche ethnic German. And it's just not when you look into prisoner of war interrogations, lists of POWs, German accounts, it's just not there. So I'm struggling where does this come from? And this is one of the things I do address a bit in one of the chapters I have, where I introduce what is a German infantry division, and I talk a bit about manpower and just lay out a few of these questions and what do we know, what don't we know? Because there's a lot of things we still don't know, and we need to accept that. But as long as we don't keep repeating these things as if they are facts, I think we already are able to get a lot further than we have for a lot of decades.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's messy. I don't know other way to say it other than that. I met an ethnic German who served in the East. He didn't serve in the West, and talking to him, there was some interesting things he said about how he identified himself, especially during the war and after. It was quite interesting how he talked about it and kind of saying he wasn't German in that sense, because I don't think he wanted to be associated with the issues, but that's just my own experience. But
there's a very interesting joke from somewhere in Eastern Europe. I think it's in multiple areas, and it's my grandfather lived in 5 countries during the war, and he never left the house he was born in.
Yeah. I think I've seen that too. Yeah,
and that's sort of the complexity of that particular subject. So it's very difficult to put things into numbers and in an assessment of how good or how bad are these troops. But it's important to realize that this is not as black and white as people like us to believe, and that someone in a German uniform who's an ethnic German might well fight very well or not, and that's just. But don't say all these ethnic Germans. They were very poor fighters and they didn't believe in the cause, because that's not based on the records I can find.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I mean, I see it. I think it has to do with so much with the popularity of the topic of just Normandy, right? It's this big thing that's over us all and will be over us all for a very long time, and just the myths and the misunderstandings and people's own wants of the way the campaign they want it to be. So I think it's fighting a lot of things that have been established. But it's a fascinating one. Sorry there, Chester Wilmot was getting some of the talk in the sidebar, so I'm trying to fight through all those to find the questions. Phil Wood said, I still think he is the best written account on Normandy. The power of writing, I guess. I mean, yes, it is well written, but the rest is problematic. Okay, so just one quick one. We talked about this, but the bocage and the Marks document, just real quick from Gary here. Was there anything else that you came across about pre that document of anything of this nature, of what it's like to fight in even similar conditions?
No, of course, bocage is
so.
very typical to a very small, relatively small area of France. I've not found anything before. There's a few mentions, I believe, but when I got a lot of digital files, and if the word bocage comes up, I tag it.
Oh,
and,
yeah. Right.
And some years ago, I did a check on how many times I had the word bocage in there, and it was almost nothing. And the only thing that was really important, is the Marks file from, I think it's April or something, 1943. I don't quote me on that, but it's something like that. And that's when someone for the first time seems to start to come up with a doctrine and identify specific problems that you're going to encounter, some opportunities this offers in defense, in offense.
Right. Yeah.
But until that particular moment, I don't see there is a particular amount of attention. I have no doubt that individual formations staying in a particular area. We're looking at this terrain and thinking, how are we going to fight here? But I think a lot of that was just stayed within those particular formations. And if they left, they took that interpretation of the situation with them. And like I said, a lot of troops are stationed on the coast, and the coastline is most troops are on the coast basically. So you're not going to do a lot of thinking and exercises. There's some rotation systems the Germans use. So especially early in the war, we can see that a division of a battalion goes to the coast, relieves a battalion there that goes into reserve, and then it's either used to build defenses or for training or a combination. And that happens early in the war, and then it continues pretty much all the way up to the invasion. You can see that that's one of the reasons that we end up with the 9th 16th Regiment at Omaha Beach, where earlier it had been the 9th 15th, but the 9th 15th had been rotated out, and that was the reserve regiment. And if it had continued for a few more months, it may well have been sent to another part of the coast, and then that particular regiment in that area would have become the reserve regiment. So that's quite possible that would have happened like that.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, that it's not necessarily, I say, like a doctrinal thing, but maybe down to maybe the division level. I don't know, regimental level. Maybe it's hard to say without the documents, right? We don't know.
And one thing that may be interesting to think about is that for a long time, since 1941, there were a lot of divisions rotating through Normandy.
Yeah,
and these divisions were all involved in planning the Atlantic Wall. So you look at the situation, you know the weaponry you have available, the number of troops you have available, and then you lay out you come up basically with the idea for the defenses, and you coordinate that with the fortress engineers, and so that they're looking at, does this work, and how we're going to do this, and what kind of weapons do we need, what fortifications do we need. But when a division leaves after having planned this, what's going to happen to that sector, especially when a weaker formation comes in? So there was a difficulty in maintaining a continuous development of the coastal defenses, and that's one of the reasons they come up with these static divisions, so sector-bound formations.
Yeah.
And initially they tried to compensate for this by creating a static officer, so responsible for, and he would stay in place, and when a new division came in, he would help them to explain what's going on and see that the developments were continuous. So that's a problem the Germans are having, and they're trying to deal with that. And a lot of that are problems that they see in the field and then takes considerable time to come up with solutions, or they improvise in the field, and then at some point this gets turned into not a doctrine, but in a fixed system, and there are commands being created. You can see that with the Cherbourg defenses. They have people there, and the fortress commander he's there in a part to help coordinate the fighting if that would happen, but he's for a very significant part, he's also there to help to make sure that the defenses are continuously developed in the same way, and you're not dependent on the divisions in that particular sector, because those might change. So that's that particular way going on to try to deal with that particular problem.
Makes sense to me. You just gave me tons of things to think about in terms of doctrine and how that works from unit to unit, because there's a lot of assumptions around that, just generally in military history and even military circles about doctrine and what that means, and more in lines than what I was thinking about. So just a quick question. Where's the best place to buy your book?
If you're in the UK, the best place is the publisher, Panzerx. Best for the publisher, best for me. In the United States, there is, I think you can just Google it. There's the importer of Panzerx. It's probably the quickest, and I understand there's a considerable batch of books on their way there.
Okay.
In France, there's a few places in France. In Germany, you have a scale model shop called Modellbaukönig. They have it in store, I believe, still, and they also ship throughout Europe. So there's, generally speaking, if a lot of people I know like the Panzerx books with all the photos and things, and if you have an outlet that has Panzerx, they should be able to get you a copy of my book.
Yeah, I put some Amazon links down below just because they're affiliate links for me, but I was looking at them, and some of them are not the best because the timing is not fantastic.
And there is one outlet in Canada as well, I believe.
Yeah, I forget the name of it. FJJ or something.
Something like
anyway,
that, yeah.
I googled your book a bunch of times. It came up, no problem. It'll come up based on your location. Yeah, so that's great. Oh, another thing I wanted to mention real quick before we end is you did the maps too, right? That's crazy. I don't know how you do both. That's wild. That must have been a lot of work.
Originally, I wanted to use the original German maps because they're original documents, and it's just I enjoyed looking at them. But then I started to realize that they don't really work when you compress them to an A4 size book. Yeah. And also they're very different in style. So you have this command does it this way, this one does that way. So what I try to do is to use them to base my maps directly on these German maps, and then clean them up a bit, highlight some things, so to show people pretty much what the Germans how they were assessing the situation. And there's sometimes you can see there's Allied formations are missing or they're incorrect, but I kept that in because this gives the German perspective. Right. And that's also why I give the archival numbers of these particular maps so people can also look them up. And there's also some maps I've done for longer periods because most German maps are just a particular moment in time. Yep. But if it's a longer period, I've designed those myself to cover a week or 2 weeks or even longer to give people an idea of what's going on with front lines and everything. And those are very much a reconstruction using German records. Ultra is very important for that. And that's how I try to highlight things that are important and help people hopefully to by focusing on these different divisions and combining all of them together, you can get a fairly complete understanding of the fighting on the peninsula and in the future with other volumes of Normandy as a whole.
Yeah, so there you go, everybody. That's as meticulous. Well, Rick said it right here, meticulous. That's as meticulous as you're going to get redoing maps based on originals by the author of the book. I can't think of a more in-depth way of looking at that than doing it that way. So thanks, Niels. That was a great chat, as I expected it to be. Always wanted to have you on once the book was finally out to get your inside information on this one. Oh, I think we lost him there for a quick second. Hopefully he bounces back. There he is. Lost you there for a second. Yeah, so thanks for coming on. I appreciated it. Still with us? Can you hear me?
The pleasure. And
I think we're having a connection issue here at the end here.
Yeah, my pleasure to come talk to you. And if there's a future volume that's more about the Canadian sectors, I'll be.
Yeah. See if you come back in a second here.
My pleasure.
Yeah, okay. I think we're losing the connection here, so we'll end it here. So thanks again, everybody, for watching, and stay tuned for a few more live streams coming up. And oh, I think he's back. Nope, he's gone. We lost him. So everyone, thanks again for hanging out, and for Niels being on. His connection there dropped. So yeah, hopefully he keeps pushing on these volumes and gives us some more of these details, because as you saw, the level of detail is meticulous. Other than that, some live streams are coming up, so keep an eye out for those, and everyone enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye, everyone.